So my reflection over the last 20 years is that evidence-based policing gets 2 cheers, not 3, not yet. And I put that reflection in the context of the late Frederick Reddy, who was shot dead during a traffic stop in the 9th Precinct of New York City Police in 1975. I had worked with him, ridden in his car with him, and thought a lot about innovation and learning with him, because he was one of the pioneer neighborhood police team leaders in the innovative project that Police Commissioner Patrick Murphy was launching alongside a transformational approach, not only to police corruption, but also to police use of deadly force. In the early years of that decade, 2 of which I spent in the Commissioner's office as a civilian research analyst, we went from 96 people a year being shot dead by the police in a force the size of London, to within 20 years around 10. But also, at the same time, in the early 70s, 10 police officers a year were being shot to death in the line of duty. And that rate didn't drop nearly as fast as the rate at which the police were killing people, although fortunately, in the long run, the 2 rates went down together. What really made a difference in Frederick Reddy's life and death was the slow pace of innovation and learning with respect to bulletproof vests. Had he made that traffic stop with the driver of the car coming out guns blazing, just a couple of years later, he might have had a Kevlar vest on. The development at DuPont for a better, lighter way of protecting officers from bullets was making progress. And in fact, the vests were available in 1975 when he died, but there hadn't been this learning about the benefit of spending the money on the vests. In fact, until the end of the 1970s, all over the United States, big city corporations and foundations were raising money, taking donations to buy bulletproof vests for police. Because, of course, the city couldn't afford such luxuries, but the police were allowed to wear them if somebody would buy them. Well, I'm happy to say that it's no longer questioned that a bulletproof vest is an essential part of a police officer's kit. But I will say that slow learning is still a problem, as it was for the British Navy, which received a report from Dr. James Lind in the middle of the 18th century saying that lime juice could prevent scurvy and save thousands of sailors' lives. Not only that, and help win battles. And the Naval Medical Board refused to adopt lime juice until the end of the century, after the death of the head of the Royal Society, who was an Aristotelian, who said, I don't care about the evidence, it doesn't work in theory, so we can't do it. Well, the evidence for making decisions is what evidence-based policing is all about. It's what I tried to take as a model from medicine and apply directly to policing in that lecture in 1998, with the general statement that evidence-based policing, like evidence-based medicine, which was trying to change a field in which over 90% of medical decisions were being made without any evidence, based on theories or what they'd been taught in medical school. And that motivated in the early 90s this move towards much more careful assessment of what was known about the effects of various medical treatments. And having read an excellent book on that on a long flight back from Australia, I tried to do a fairly direct read-over of lateral thinking into policing, which has later been translated as saying everything in police do has to be supported by a randomized controlled trial, which it was not what I was really saying. And in fact, I hope to clarify that with all the things I'd learned from my Cambridge, mostly British police officers who I'd been teaching since 2007. By 2013, we had tried to refine the whole process into the 3 T's of getting the best evidence for selective investment of police resources to get the biggest benefits for reducing harm, as the basis for testing what works with those selective investments, and then to track whether the things that are policy are actually happening in practice. The third T being the biggest challenge that remains for evidence-based medicine, where doctors routinely refuse to wash their hands between touching patients. A fact was established by a quasi-experimental trial in 1845 in Vienna by Ignaz Semmelweis, for which he was punished and driven out of the medical profession because he demonstrated a way to cut mortality of newborn mothers by 2/3. And the doctors thought he was blaming the doctors for having killed them, therefore he can't be right. So I think you're getting a theme here that evidence-based policing is about as welcome as the curse of Cassandra in many cases. But the rubber meets the road when you track to see whether the targeting and the testing based on evidence is actually being carried out in terms of the basic operations in policing. So to think not as a sequence, but as a simultaneous process of trying to strategically and tactically examine the decisions police are making on a daily basis is, to me, the full framework of evidence-based policing, the framework that leads us to have 3 cheers, still a goal in the distance, but at least 2 reasons to be cheerful about the idea of moving policing towards a greater reliance on evidence in everyday decision-making. The idea of 2 cheers for something good is not mine. It's E.M. Forster's, who in the early days of World War I broadcast some pretty controversial thoughts about democracy, applauding its toleration of individual freedom and self-criticism, but deploring its encouragement of mediocrity, and saying that we may still contrive to raise 3 cheers for democracy, although at present she only deserves 2. Or in his own words, 2 cheers for democracy, 1 because it admits variety, and 2 because it permits criticism. But what about evidence-based policing? Well, if we take 3 somewhat different T's to ask, is policing talking about evidence-based policing? Yes, there's lots of talking. Is policing testing its practices? Yes, absolutely, far more than ever before. Is policing at a tipping point in which evidence consultation is a routine part of everyday decision-making, which is what I would define as the institutionalization of the idea? And my answer would be, he must be joking. Nowhere near doing that yet. And so it's worth reflecting on how the next 20 years might go with respect to those 3 criteria. But let's just review how good the talking has been. It was pretty slow in the United States from 1998 to 2007, but I have to say, when we had an opportunity to change the curriculum of the master's degree in applied criminology and police management at Cambridge University, we were able to have something to do with a rapid growth in discussions within the UK and spreading out ripple effects globally by the various criteria that you see listed here: Google Scholars, publications, conferences, the foundation of societies in which police practitioners spend their time talking about research. I think that was an inconceivable idea to me in 1998. In fact, even in 2007, let alone the cumulative usage of the phrase evidence-based policing in publications, and especially the way in which, just since 2015, that has taken off with almost a geometric increase. So perhaps a tipping point in scholarship, not to mention the books that are now being published, which aim to make it more accessible to policing. My former students who have produced these books are working very hard. I don't think we're there yet on having an accessible read, if indeed reading is the way to do it, for operational police in the field. And last night we had a chance to reflect on the method that's used for agricultural research dissemination in the United States, where the field extension agents of the agricultural schools talk over the fence one-on-one with the farmers and help them to make better decisions about both profitability of their operations and sustainability, as well as increased food production. The course at Cambridge continues to be a very powerful force, in my view, with over 500 graduates now worldwide, whose leadership abilities, I think, brought them to Cambridge. We didn't give them those kinds of abilities, but what we did was to give them a framework and a set of tools that has led them to do things like creating the first Society of Evidence-Based Policing, which Alex Murray, now on secondment to the Home Office and about to go into the Strategic Command course, Alex founded this society with some other Cambridge graduates and others who had not been to Cambridge, but who were very committed to the idea of better evidence. And this society became known to police in other countries. And so the next thing you know, we had an Australia and New Zealand Society of Evidence-Based Policing, which with about 30 million population, they had almost as many members as the UK society. Less numbers in Canada, but spreading there as well as to the United States. And just this month, the founding in a country of 1.3 billion with 2 million police, potential for a lot of interest and activity with the Indian Police Service, consisting of some 3,500 chief officers who are, I think, more now than ever, very interested in trying to move a very under-resourced police service towards better use of its resources. The creation of the College of Policing in 2012, I think, was another major step forward in getting people to at least be talking about evidence-based policing, trying to define what it is, focusing on questions of what works. And then in a number of police agencies, the creation of special units or teams whose job it is to help communicate the results of research in policing and to encourage people in those agencies to do their own research, to foster the idea of being a pracademic, a practitioner academic who designs their own studies in collaboration with advice from academics, but who undertake the leadership for carrying out the field tests, the field tracking, even the targeting decisions. And these agencies have all done this. New Zealand did it, and they've already abolished their evidence-based policing unit. So there is a kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back in any attempt to change the way a profession thinks about its work. Someone reflected in a discussion last night about how lawyers had absolutely no interest in evidence, and that the police were actually at the top of the game in terms of criminal justice, which was a point that I learned in trying to get prosecutors involved in police experiments 30 years ago. But what's even more important, perhaps, is the extent to which police innovations, organizational learning through better evidence, is now being preserved in publications that, because of the web and because of open access policies, strongly supported by the governments of both parties in the UK, we now have more research publications to talk about, in which there are findings on all 3 T's that are coming out in peer-reviewed international journals. In fact, as an example, the first test of the body-worn video cameras, which was a Cambridge University master's thesis written by a Californian police chief who ran this trial in Rialto, California, has now been downloaded 47,000 times. Probably not by academics, I would say, but by people who were very interested, not just as police, but also as people who were involved in governance of police, to learn something about what the Rialto trial has found. And since last year, we've had our own Nature Springer journal for evidence-based policing, which is hitting pretty good download numbers itself, over 1,000 downloads per article. There are many university presses that are happy to sell 1,000 copies of a book ever. And In the first year, we had over 7 articles with over 1,000 downloads, one of which is written by the chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, Sarah Thornton, who discovered that previous suicide attempts are the best predictor of domestic homicide. How many of you had heard that fact before I just said it? Very few of you, okay? Isn't that an important fact? Aren't we failing in our talking about evidence-based policing in that we can't communicate some really important ideas? And that's an idea that has been tested now in 5 other places and consistently showing that that's the best predictor. And yet we haven't changed the evidence-based targeting systems for identifying people to the extent police can with previous attempts or even ideation about suicide. Eamon Bridgers, the second article up there, reviewed 2 years of the domestic violence death reviews in England and Wales. And he found that 40% of the men who killed their partner had, we discover after they've done it, had either attempted suicide or had talked to their family about it. But the police didn't know that. The police had no way of picking that up through health information. Other community agencies, if they knew about it, weren't telling the police. And police records themselves can give very powerful indications, such as the custody records where people are talking about self-harm, which Leicestershire, Ian Button's research in Leicestershire showed tripled the risk that somebody would attempt to kill their partner after they had already come into the custody suite and threatened to self-harm or showed indications of that. But clearly, the fact that we've got it in print, that anybody anywhere in the world can go to the website for this journal and read those articles about predicting domestic homicide, is a better position for the field to be in than it was 2 years ago before such a journal existed. So we're talking a lot about targeting cases, certainly targeting for prevention. It's helping us to understand the nature of this, not so much pyramid as the Arabian tent, in which the highest harm 2% may, 2 or 3% may account for over 80% of the total harm, and this idea of a harm index as a single currency for what the police are trying to prevent, as opposed to this confusing hodgepodge of over 700 substantive criminal offenses in England and Wales, I think has been a major reason that we can understand targeting in better ways. For example, in Dorset, which published the finding last year that less than 4% of the victims suffered 85% of the harm of any victims in Dorset in that year. What does that mean? Well, the crime harm index is simply a way of combining all of the crimes that are reported by victims, not detected by police, because that distorts the whole picture, but crimes reported by victims or witnesses, in which you take the crime category and you multiply the number of those crimes by the number of days of imprisonment that the crime would get if it were solved and conviction led to a punishment. And so if you sum together all those days in prison that would have been assigned to all of those crimes had they been solved, you get the crime harm index, which can be derived from days in prison by sentencing guidelines, which is what we recommend for England and Wales. The Danish crime harm index has been developed using prosecutorial guidelines, much the same, given the role of the prosecutor in Denmark. In Western Australia, they've taken the actual sentences, but limited it to first offenders, so that you can take out the influence of the criminal history of the offender, on the grounds that if you're killed by a first offender or a repeat offender, you're just as dead. And so if it's a victim-centered harm index, it needs to be focused not on the prior characteristics of the offender, but on the nature of the harm in the crime itself. California, in a hotspot study, has used its crime harm index based on guidelines. Canadian and New Zealand index is straightforward in just taking the average sentence for the crime, given the prior records of the offender, and that's what the Office of National Statistics has done. And as of this July, they're now publishing the crime severity score trends since 2002 for every police force in England and Wales compared to the crime counts. And those trends, I think you're going to start seeing in the newspapers pretty soon, because on top of all the other bad news we've heard lately, when you take the crime harm seriously, crime harm is rising more rapidly now than crime count. And that will cut through a lot of the stuff about how much increase there's been in murder or knife crime or whatever. This systematic way of looking at it, I think, helps us to target in ways I can illustrate very quickly with the Danish crime count, which has been dropping since 2011. And as our master's thesis from the Danish police reported this year, the crime count's down and the harm trend is way up. So if you want to understand how safe a community is, if you want to understand how dangerous an individual offender is in their criminal history, you need to go beyond the counts unless you think that all crimes are created equal. And I don't think anybody in this room believes that. But we have been witnessing government and news media obsess about crime count. Crime is down 15%, up 10%, as if all crimes are created equal. And evidence-based policing helps us to stop doing that. So hip hip hooray for better talk and better tests of all kinds, not just randomized trials, even descriptive mapping for targeting purposes or for tracking purposes. I'm going to show you a study in a bit that's the best hotspots experiment ever done, but the most interesting thing to me is the tracking of where the police cars were in this part of Perth, Australia, called Armadale. And so if you're 2 kilometers away from the police station, I write all the best things on my hand. If you're 2 kilometers away from the police station, you're 65 times less likely to encounter a patrol car than if you're 200 meters from the police station. And this wonderful map of how, for one reason or another, starting with 40% of all police patrol time is spent inside the police station. If you're tracking that seriously, you can see that, in fact, there is this distribution of odds of the police intercepting a crime in progress that may well be unknown to most offenders, but will have some consequences that have implications for police budgets in England and Wales, among other things. But before we get to that and the testing that is associated with it, let's just celebrate the fact that, according to Peter Nehru's register, there has been a 4-fold growth in the randomized controlled trials in policing since 1998. This is what the cumulative number looks like. Worldwide, the first randomized trial in policing in the world was launched in Liverpool in 1963, reported in 1970, and that's when this graph begins. And that progress, as you can see, is heavily comprised in recent years of the growth, primarily in the UK, which is now the #1 country on earth for rigorous testing of police practices. Although Australia is trying to catch up, so let's hold back on too loud a cheer for testing. But what about the third cheer, the idea of a tipping point away from not even asking the question of, do we have any evidence on this decision we're about to make? And as somebody, again, in the discussion last night said, at Amazon, you can't propose anything unless you've got a lot of data to discuss as part of the story. That's the culture of Amazon. Amazon has its bad points and its good points. I'm certainly not holding it up as a model for policing. But it's just interesting to contrast the organizational culture in which you don't even think about making a decision without asking what data are available. And that would not be the case in policing anywhere in the world, in my experience so far. But we are at least seeing some signs of transition between that way of making decisions and a more evidence-informed approach, even as we see transitions in that direction and then away from it as we go from one chief to the next. I would say in West Midlands, Hampshire, and Greater Manchester, in the past decade, we have seen the movement to evidence-based thinking survive the transition in chief constables. So that's certainly worthy of some satisfaction. But we're not doing what the handmade Rolls-Royce had to ultimately do to catch up with the Ford assembly line, which is to figure out how to make these decisions in a standardized way that has a business model for how we make decisions better and how we learn from the decisions that turned out to have been wrong in the ways that Matthew Syed has talked about and which Sarah Thornton and others have repeatedly said it would be great if we could move in that direction in policing. And clearly, we're not there yet. We've got Lewin's force field model telling us that there's plenty of forces resisting the change and restraining efforts to do things like adopt evidence-based calculations for managing demand, for setting priorities, for having machines advise professionals in the same way that if we want to talk about evidence-based medicine, we're seeing increasing evidence that the digitally informed or big data supported doctor is able to make better diagnostic decisions with the computers. Another story out on that this week. Is able to help save lives and use medicines in a more targeted way, in a more effective way, as well as to do things like save time by connecting to a patient through video links rather than having to get the patient physically into the presence of a doctor unless it's a certain kind of condition where that's required. And so policing is already looking different and may well be moving in the direction of more video contact for policing, which is so much faster than waiting for a patrol car to arrive for an hour or 2 days, as the case may be. The domain awareness system in New York City is already analyzing the input it's getting from various sources around the city with real-time calculations that set off alarms to the police based on intelligence that's being digitally processed in the same way that you get a 999 call that says something's bad is happening here, we need a police car right away. And what's interesting to me about this model is that it creates the possibility of a less biased analysis of demand from the community set of problems that the police have to choose among and inevitably have to make triage decisions about in terms of what they will do and what they can't do, because they now have information that somebody might choose not to report, or indeed, as we know in the United States, when they get a report of something like black person offering to mow my lawn for a fee, I am scared of this person because they're black, send a police car right away. If you read the New York Times regularly, you'll see reports like that all over the US. And so the idea that a 999 call is something that has to be taken seriously, or a 911 call in the US state where that happened, means that you send a police car, rather than assessing the content of the call and deciding whether the act of sending a police car is actually imposing on the person who's being accused in a way that may not make sense. If you could do a video interview with somebody before the car arrived, it might avoid creating conflict by virtue of the police response as opposed to trying to manage it. So all of these possibilities for digital tracking, I think, can be illustrated best by a story from Thames Valley a few years ago. They apparently, with their new 999 system, they installed a tracker that calculated the number of seconds, between the first ring for a 999 call and when the call takers answered the call. The threshold was set pretty high up, might have been 30 seconds, might have been 60 seconds. But if it hits the threshold, an alarm goes off. I don't know if it's bells and lights and whistles and smoke, but somebody's notified immediately. In fact, the protocol was to notify the chief constable. So Sarah Thornton tells a story that she got this alarm for the first time in years as being chief constable and took great care to find out what had happened. And it was one of these perfect storms of influenza and all the caretakers being call takers being sick at once, so they were terribly understaffed. Then there were some unique conditions that led to more calls. In any case, all it does is to illustrate that you don't have to have a human being watching over everything at all times if these are things that are being monitored or tracked by digital processing anyway. You can create the notification that in effect triggers proactive response by the police in the same way that a 999 call triggers reactive response by police. So hold on to that principle and consider this breaking news from Perth, Australia. which for me is really great cause for celebration, because it breaks through in an area of learning that goes to the core of policing. Around the world, the majority of police budget is invested in patrol. The purpose of patrol, since Robert Peel, has been to prevent crime through the deterrent threat of the visible presence of police officers. Around the world, incidentally, patrol is in decline because people have so many other things that they'd rather the police do rather than the basic job. So how do we defend the basic job or even test the theory that Peel was right? Well, as you know, there's been quite a few hotspots experiments, but they've been pretty imprecise in measuring things like how many times the police visited the hotspot, how long they stayed when they were there, how long it took after they left for the first crime to occur. And we've had some evidence on that, but this latest study, I think, helps us to see very clearly that hotspots policing works with much shorter visits than we thought, if they're regular. And in fact, they could even go several days without being visited. But what they can't do, at least in Perth, is to go 4 or 5 days or more without having a patrol car at least drive through a hotspot and spend about 13 to 15 minutes over the total of a day. Because if 5 days of inattention, certainly 5 days of inattention to my grandchildren, would cause all hell to break loose, probably well before 5 days. But in this case, the hotspot's tipping point is the 5 days. So what's the evidence for that? Well, first of all, we're talking about places where crime is substantially concentrated. This is my favorite three-dimensional map to show that pattern. Incidentally, when it was shown to the Tokyo police leaders in 2005 from the National Research Institute, they said, thanks very much. What else do you want to talk about? Because they didn't want to change anything about the even distribution of patrol across the entire city, as opposed to targeting the violent hotspots in Tokyo at nighttime. What we've seen in a lot of analysis, which David Weisberg now calls the law of crime concentrations, most crime occurs in a tiny proportion of all places in a city, about 3% of street addresses producing 50% or more of the crime. No police agency directs that level of patrol to those places. In fact, as I was told by a foot patrol officer yesterday, they go to a different hotspot every day depending on what happened yesterday or the day or the week before, whereas the longer term analyses show that you're 80% at worst. Over the next year, you're 80% correct if you go back to the same hotspots. And that's the premise of this experiment that we did initially in Minneapolis in the late 1980s, in which we showed that there was less crime in the areas, 55 of them randomly signed out of 110, that received from 7% of the day, there's a police car there, that's the control group. We doubled it to actually 15% in the experimental group, and had a substantial reduction in crime. That was the experiment. The biggest finding that has stuck with police is the Koper curve. And this is non-experimental. It's simply a correlation in which we had 18 social science graduate students with clipboards and stopwatches, and they were writing down the time when the police car came into the hotspot and when it left, and then when the first crime or active disorder occurred after the police car left. So what this shows you is how long the police car stayed in the car, in the hotspot, when it did arrive, and then as you're going up the left-hand axis, it's the amount of time after they've left before the first crime occurs. So the longer you stay, from 1 minute to 10 to 15 minutes, the longer the deterrent effect is on crime and disorder in the hotspot after the police leave. And the people who've seen this and got it think it's not only cool that that's true, but that at the end there's diminishing returns. So it tells you there's no point in staying any longer. Sadly, hotspot policing around the world has often been done in terms of, this is your assignment, stay there. And people have stayed there for 8 hours. John Stevens says the location where Prime Minister Percival was killed in Parliament in 1812 has had a fixed post for almost 200 years because somebody said, stand there after the murder occurred. And that person was relieved But sadly, it wasn't a hotspot anymore. And sadly, the Coper curve is about to be displaced. Because this is a correlation, because it has certainly very impressive evidence in the next 30 minutes, which is that you can cut the risk of a crime or active disorder by 75% if the police stay there at least 10 minutes compared to having a police car just drive by. But it's only one city. Well, that's true in most experiments. But it's only a correlation, so it doesn't control for other possible causes of this effect or this pattern. And it's only 30 minutes, and it's not days. Nobody ever asked the question of whether police deterrent effects could last for days. And certainly it's not got the crime-harm index in it. So it's just counting high volume, low seriousness stuff. What do we really care about? We'd like to see the crime-harm index go down, which is what is used in the Barnes-William decay spike, which is breaking news from the Western Australia Police, not yet published, but they had follow-ups for up to 10 days in this particular design using the crime-harm index in Western Australia, and it does show that the frequency of patrol matters in days and not minutes. So what kind of experiment was this? Well, it was in 15 selected hotspots for 245 days, and on every day, when the police came to work, they were told the random assignment of a different hotspot. So it's the same police, the same hotspots, but not every hotspot on every day was getting the extra patrol treatment. And so what did they do when they went to the patrol there? Well, most of the time they were there less than 5 minutes. 75% of the time they were there less than 1 minute. This is hotspots policing that cops like. They don't want to go stay there for 10 to 15 minutes, Coper curve or no Coper curve. They would like to go to a place, check it out, see if there's anybody there who looks interesting, see if there's a problem, and then go on to something else. That's the kind of restless, roving behavior that attracts people into patrol work in the first place. And more power to them if the empirical evidence shows that it's having this great effect, which it does for up to 4 days. But if they don't come back within the 5-day period, then daily crime harm rises by 5-fold on the daily basis, as the data will show you. This is what happens with the recorded offending and the prevalence of crime harm. Was there any crime at all in the control period up to 5 days? Well, slightly more. So no big story there. If you were just using the old Home Office rules about was there one or more crime, then you wouldn't have said this is very important. Recently, about 10 years ago, we got the Home Office to at least look at crime counts. And by crime frequency, it actually shows comparing no patrol for 5 days to the day on which they got the extra patrol, there's a 42% reduction, the annualized equivalent of 568 fewer offenses per year on the treatment days. So if you can go to the hotspot every day for a minute or two, then you might be able to get substantial prevention through deterrence. But what about the counterfactual, which I'm sure many police departments have right now, where hotspots are not getting any patrol for 5 days or more because they're just overwhelmed with demand to go elsewhere as opposed to where the pedestrian gatherings are generating crime harm, including robbery, including serious assaults. And so that's how we can see in Perth that compared to not having been patrolling those hotspots for 5 days in the far right-hand corner with 39,000 prison years worth of offending occurring under the condition of there's been no patrol there for 5 days. Compared to that, if you have the police come for a minute or so, you're getting an 80% reduction in crime. I think this is the most convincing evidence I've ever seen for the value of what is called routine patrol, which seems to be the first thing that gets cut to do other things that sound more politically popular, but which arguably is the fundamental public health strategy behind policing that we see whenever there's a police strike. And guess what happens in every police strike that's ever been studied, including one in Helsinki in 1976 in the middle of January, where they were looking at hospital records of people being injured by violent attacks. In the middle of the winter in Helsinki, if the police stop patrolling, all hell breaks loose. In Toronto, where bank robberies went up 3,500% when the police went on strike. Anywhere you look, if you take the basic element of policing off the streets, you get a lot of crime. And that's what this is showing, essentially, hotspot by hotspot. If the cops haven't been around in 5 days, look out. So I could tell you more about this experiment, but I won't. Let me just go back to say, what about this alarm business? Suppose there was a GPS program which does not require any new data. And this experiment was actually done with the advanced system of giving the police in the experiment iPhones with GPS indicators. And so we knew where they were on patrol at all times. We knew that they were sometimes in the control areas, but not very much. And the research that Jeff Barnes and Sergeant Simon Williams, formerly the West Midlands Police, recruited to go to Australia because he was such a good experimenter as a sergeant with his 8 PCSOs in Birmingham. So what does this tell us? This tells us that we could take the data we have and generate an alarm that says, look out, no police officer's been there for 4 days now. You better get a car to drive through there tomorrow. And that might prevent that increase in crime, that spike in crime that's occurring as the deterrent effect is decaying over that period. So without getting into the detail, you can see that the difference in the number of patrols was about 4 to 1. The duration of the patrols when they did the patrols, 13.7 minutes per day. But that was, again, mostly in 1, 2, 3 minute snatches. So if they drove through several times in the day, that's how they worked up to the 13.7 minutes. And so the total for that 80% reduction compared to no patrol for 5 days was only 8 additional days of patrol targeted in those areas. So pretty cost effective if you want to get that benefit out of it. And it brings us to re-engineering the whole process of police assignment, in which we could use big data to generate minute-by-minute advice to shift commanders who are balancing targeting and tracking of places, offenders, and victims, responding to the HMI request that you detect undetected domestic abuse, human slavery, other kinds of secretive crimes that are very high in harm, which in a better evidence-based world, the police would get credit not for having reported so that their crime goes up, but they get credit for having discovered it so that they go on the other side of the ledger book as having done something good in uncovering and stopping serious crimes that are ongoing, using the crime harm index to assess both prevention and punishment, as opposed to these very misleading measures like the percentage of all cases that are resulting in a sanctioned detection. This is what we're doing with a number of police agencies at the moment. We are trying to develop an IT-engineered system of evidence-based policing that we call the Cambridge Allocation Management, in which the biggest initial success has been this thing called EBIT right there, which is using an algorithm with non-domestic violence, 31% of Kent's police cases being public order offenses that include common assault, mostly male on male, mostly not pursued by virtue of the victim's refusal to cooperate with anything further, and it's been assessed by HMIC and found to be an appropriate use of police resources and sufficiently or quite adequately responsive to victims' preferences. So that's for targeting investigations or secondary investigations after the initial investigations. It's also potentially a way to generate the proactive targeting of the most harmed victims so far this year, as in the Dorset study, the most harmful offenders so far this year, as in another study that found that most of the most serious domestic abusers were not in prison, and they're out on the streets, and what are we doing about them? We had a terrible case in Cambridge recently where somebody who had previously attempted to murder their partner tried to murder another one. And all of this can come together not in the call takers with minimum wage and high turnover, but with a chief superintendent who is watching over all resources at all times in a police agency, balancing different ways of policing, but all around the common goal of reducing the crime harm index value of reported crimes and increasing the crime harm index value of police detected and discovered crimes so that they can be terminated. And we have all these decision support tools. We have the potential to apply them in the context of more video policing to save resources. We have the potential for a master's degree at the senior leaders level to fund apprenticeships so that the cost for police agencies to be training its leadership in the development of this strategy will become very, very low relative to the apprenticeship levy that's already been allocated. And so are we getting close to the third cheer? Well, probably not, because all of this is really hard, and there's lots of obstacles in the way. So I'm going to stick with my 2 cheers because we haven't seen a tipping point yet. We may not see a tipping point, but what we are doing day by day is building a lot more evidence for evidence-based policing, brick by brick. Thank you very much.